Something that I find interesting is seeing what other people's game collections look like. There's always some quirky stuff that you've probably never heard of before, and games with sentimental value that have personal stories behind how they were obtained or what they mean to the owner. What I'm looking at in this video though is a specific thing which you might have encountered before, where you end up buying a game more than once. Maybe it's because it's been remastered or remade, maybe because you wanted it on a home console as well as something portable like the Switch, or maybe you needed 2 copies on the same system to play online with someone in the same house as you. Whatever the reason for the double, triple, or god forbid quadruple dipping is, I want to know what games in your collections you own the most copies of. But for now, let's scour my game shelf and find out what game I've purchased the most. So it turns out that I actually own a lot of games twice. This is probably reasonably common considering how frequently things are remade nowadays, but there's so many games that fall into this category that it's ridiculous. Rayman and Rayman 2, Super Mario Bros, Link's Awakening, Breath of the Wild, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Metal Gear Solid, Super Mario 64, Sunshine and Galaxy, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes, the Sly Cooper PS2 trilogy, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, Mario Kart 8, Captain Toad, Dark Souls 2, Demon's Souls. There's almost so many here that it's pointless going through everything, and I think that's probably the case for a lot of people. A lot of the time, the reason for me owning 2 copies of these games is because they received a remake, remaster, or some kind of expanded version. There's a few exceptions though, like with Rayman 2, where the PS1 and Dreamcast versions are actually quite dramatically different, with the Dreamcast one being considered the best by most fans and even the creator of the game. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 is also quite different between the PS1 and PS2 versions, running on totally different engines, having altered level designs, and of course being graphically completely distinct from each other. But let's move on to the next tier with games I own 3 times. This is actually surprisingly common in my collection, so I'm interested to know if this is the same for other people too. I guarantee that a lot of people will own 3 of the same games in the Pokemon series. Because they normally have a dual release and later on a 3rd expanded version, if you got all 3 of those, then that's a triple dip purchase right there. Throw in the fact that a lot of earlier Pokemon games have been remade and that those remakes are also a dual release, and you've got a lot of potential for repeat buys. For me, the Gen 2 Pokemon games fall into the 3 game category, with me owning Pokemon Gold, which I only recently picked up in order to play through it with my girlfriend, Pokemon Crystal, which is the version of the game that I played as a kid, and then Pokemon Heart Gold, which is the DS remake, and in my opinion is the single best Pokemon game ever made, at least out of the ones that I've played. I'm a massive fan of the original Crash Bandicoot and Spyro games, and they're probably some of the most defining games of my childhood and a massive part of the reason that I'm passionate about games in general. Because of this, it's probably no surprise that I own multiple copies of them. I still have my childhood copies of Crash Bandicoot 1, 2, 3 and Crash Team Racing and the whole Spyro trilogy on PS1, but of course I also picked up the Insane trilogy, Reignited trilogy and Nitro Fueled remakes on PS4, and later double dipped on the remakes with the Switch versions of all of those so that I could more easily introduce my girlfriend to them. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 are another set of games that I owned 3 times. This is actually slightly different though, with me having them on PS1 and PS4 with the remake, but instead of owning the remake on the Switch, I actually have the much lesser known Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X on the original Xbox. This was a remaster of the first 2 games, and because of its Xbox exclusivity and the fact it wasn't released outside of America, it kind of flew under a lot of people's radar, which is disappointing considering it's probably the definitive version of the original games, not including the remake. Despite its name suggesting it's only the second game, it actually includes the entire first game too. The original Resident Evil is another weird one because I have this twice on PS1 with the vanilla original version and the director's cut, which features some updated mechanics and is basically just an improved version of the base game. But then I also have the PS4 remaster of the GameCube remake in the form of the Origins collection. This is one where a lot of people might have this more than 3 times. You might have the DS version or the GameCube remake, which would bulk up the numbers massively. But okay, let's kick things up a notch and take a look at the games that I own 4 times. Now this is where things start to get a little bit ridiculous. Starting this off, we have a game where I can easily see myself owning at least 6 copies of in the near future. For now though, it sits at 4, and it's Metal Gear Solid 3, one of my favourite games ever made. I have the original Snake Eater version on the PS2, which I got close to its release and was the first version I played. I then got the Subsistence version, which was also on the PS2, but is massively improved from the first version because of the full camera control and the 2 entire discs of extras. I then have the HD collection on PS3, which was a great improvement because it upscales the resolution to 720p and increases the frame rate to 60 FPS. Then finally, I have Metal Gear Solid 3D on the 3DS, which is potentially the most interesting version because it's the only one that lets you crouch walk and aim in third person. The reason that this could very easily increase to 6 copies is because I don't yet have the Master Collection on PS5, and there's also the upcoming remake with Metal Gear Solid Delta, which I'll definitely be getting on release. At that point, it'll probably be one of the games that I own the most copies of. Now we move up to games where I own 5 copies. We're entering the realm of utter stupidity at this point, but there is only one game that I own this many times. This series has already made an appearance in this video, and it'll probably come as no surprise that one of the games I own the most copies of is Pokemon Red and Blue, or I guess more accurately, Pokemon Gen 1. So my Pokemon adventure actually began with Pokemon Yellow, but shortly afterwards I also got a copy of Pokemon Blue, probably because I was interested in seeing what the differences were. Much later on, I got the Game Boy Advance remake with Pokemon Leaf Green, and then even more recently than that, I also got the second Gen 1 remake with Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu. After me and my girlfriend started getting into the trading card game, I figured she might enjoy the video games. So I figured I would start her off with Generation 1 and got a Let's Go Eevee, and we actually 100% completed the Pokédex together, which I had never managed to do before in any Pokemon game. But with that final repeat purchase, the total number of times I own Gen 1 Pokemon is 5. But there is one game that outperforms even Pokemon, and to be honest I'm pretty happy with this because this happens to be one of my favourite games, so place your bids now as to what it might be. While Crash Bandicoot and Spyro were 2 of the defining game series of my childhood, there's another PS1 classic which defined my taste in games potentially even more than those. And this game is Oddworld Abe's Odyssey. Now I will admit the only reason I own this so many times is due to a couple of technicalities. But before we dive into that rabbit hole, let's talk about the basics. I have my childhood copy on PS1, which was the original version of the game that I played. Soon after that I also got the PC version because I had a laptop and wanted easy access to Oddworld at all times. And to be fair, the PC version is also a little bit different, with certain object sprites being altered, a checkpoint marker being visible, and it also runs quite significantly faster. But for a long time these were the only 2 copies I owned. But then of course the Oddworld New and Tasty remake came out, and I got the Limited Run Games physical version on PS4. More recently that remake also released on the Switch, and of course I also picked up the physical version on there too. But on top of these versions, I also have a second copy on PC which came with the Kickstarter version of the Oddworld Abe's Origins art book created by Indie by Design. The only difference between this newer PC version and the original one I have is that the new art book version is on a DVD instead of a CD, and also includes the second Oddworld game, Oddworld Abe's Exodus, on the same disc. The final version of Abe's Odyssey I own is a little bit debatable as to whether it's even the same game, but I'm counting it because it does feature the same level design, it's just heavily stripped back due to hardware limitations, and that's because it's the version that released on the Game Boy. This was called Oddworld Adventures, and it literally only features a single area of the game, and the graphics are downgraded to a crazy degree. But what little part of the game is present there is indeed Abe's Odyssey, so for that reason, I'm counting it. Obviously throughout this video I've only been counting the games that I own physically, but if your collections aren't quite as big, feel free to include digital games in your collection too. Either way, definitely let me know down in the comments what your collections look like, and what your justification is for owning so many copies of the same game. It'll be interesting to see if there's any common games that keep coming up here. I suspect that Pokemon will be one of them, but we'll have to wait and see. As always, remember to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more retro content coming very soon. Remember to check out A Handheld History, now available on Amazon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.